Margaret Wertheim came to my attention through a brilliant publication called Aeon, A-E-O-N. It's an online magazine out of Australia, which is, I like to think, what we all believed Udney Reader could be, except this is actually, I think, a lot better. I was attracted to an article she had written called How to Play Mathematics. And in that article, she discussed not only this idea of how people are loath to think about being able to understand or work with mathematics when inanimate objects like crystals and animate but non-human things like corals, mollusks of other kinds, that they do complicated, not only complicated mathematical things, but in the case of the corals, have been doing hyperbolic mathematics thousands and thousands and thousands of years before we as humans discovered that there could be something other than Euclidean spaces. So it was an intriguing article, and so I thought, gosh, we'd love to have her here to talk, because it's a wonderful intersection of art and science and mathematics. And so I called her, talked to her on the phone. Turns out her twin sister had done 6-month study upstairs, 3rd floor in the Charles Peirce archive. And so Margaret was eager to come to Lubbock. She had never been here, and was also intrigued by what we were going to do. As soon as she gets in here, I'm going to quit talking, but I will tell you, we only have a short time today, but at 2 o'clock on the same floor in room 151, she'll be doing a Hyperbolic Spaces workshop with some honors undergraduate students and some other folks. There are some spots still available if you'd like to come participate in that. We'd love to have you. And regardless, tomorrow evening, starting at 6 o'clock at the Museum of Texas Tech, she'll do a talk based on that article, How to Play Mathematics, about the coral reefs, and we'll have a Q&A, a panel, and a short reception afterwards. So I would invite you to get as much of Margaret's thinking and her humanity as you have this opportunity to do, because she lives a long way off in Los Angeles. And actually she's from Australia by way of Los Angeles. So, Margaret, I leave it to you.
Are we waiting for Jessica to come back in the room? There's just been a local TV guy out there.
No, we don't need to have her. Is your computer working?
Yes. So do you want me not to wait for her?
No, go ahead and start.
Okay. So I was asked. Thank you very much, Andy, for organising this trip. It's a real honour. I have sort of mythical connection with Texas Tech, because 20 years ago my twin sister came and spent a semester here studying at the Charles Sanders Peirce Archives, which was important for her PhD. So it's always been a hope of mine to come and touch the Peirce things myself, which I just did this morning. So thank you for inviting me. In this seminar, what I'd like to do is to just give a brief introduction to the work that I've been doing in my career, trying to communicate STEM subjects to the public. And so, maybe I'll talk for like 15, no more than 20 minutes, and then it'd be lovely to have a discussion with you guys who are doing this too. So, basically a brief history of what I've been doing. So originally I went to university and studied physics and mathematics, and thought that I would become a professional physicist. That's what I originally wanted to do. But after 6 years of being in an academic science world, which at that time, at least in Australia, was extremely withdrawn from everything else. Like, not only were we in a bubble in society, we were in a bubble in the university. And while I absolutely adored physics and maths, I couldn't psychically stand being in that hermetically sealed bubble. I mean, we weren't even, the attitude when I was at university was that even all we were supposed to study was physics and maths, and even doing chemistry was considered too outre. And so I just couldn't withstand that sort of, as it were, siloing. So I decided I had to leave professional science and, or not go on to be a research scientist. And I decided what I wanted to do was communicate about science to the wider world. And because when I was at university, there were very, very few women in science. I mean, so much so that for the first 2 years of my physics degree, I was the only woman in the department, apart from the secretaries. There were no female professors, no female tutors, and for the first 2 years I was in the physics department, there were no other female students. So it was always very prominent in my mind that science was, at least particularly physical sciences, the mathematically based sciences, were very much something that didn't intersect very much with female culture. So from the moment that I decided to be a science communicator, what I wanted to do was to try to find ways to communicate to people who would not necessarily ever be readers of Scientific American or New Scientist, which were the two big science magazines sold in Australia, Scientific American from America, New Scientist, sort of the equivalent from Britain. And it was always present in my mind that basically, as far as I could tell, a fairly small sector of society read science magazines. I had an intuition who that was. And then it was in 2002, after I'd moved to the USA, that I was having a conversation with a man who at that time, a scientist who at that time was doing a column for Scientific America, and he made a comment to me one day, and he said, he wrote this column, it was one of his first columns, and he was really surprised that everybody who wrote back, he got a lot of correspondence, everyone who wrote back was a man. And he said he thought that Scientific America was reached by everybody. And I said, what planet have you been on, Michael? Don't you know? And he said no. And I said, well, the overwhelming number of people who read science magazines are men. And he said, how do you know that? And I said, well, I just know. And he said, well, would you give us a talk at this at Caltech and find out the facts? So I did. I did the research. It was 2002, so it's a while ago now, but I don't think the numbers would have really substantially changed much. So I did all the research. I contacted all of the magazines. I contacted the top 8 science magazines in America. At that time, there was only about 8. Selling any substantial numbers. And the figures were really stark. Basically, who read science magazines? 3/4 of them were well-educated, well-off white men over 40. And intuitively I knew this. I didn't know how stark the figures were. Very few women, very few people under 30. Almost no minorities. And so I presented this talk at Caltech, and the audience, many of whom, well, most of them were in the sciences, but there were some people who were science communicators, they were all stunned. And I was stunned that they were stunned, because I thought, how the hell did you not know this? Isn't it obvious? But apparently it's not. And I've given this talk a number of times. And the same thing happens. People are stunned. And I'm thinking, this is the problem. And the way that I look at it is this, that we talk about the term science communication, but communication is an interesting word. Communication happens through two things. There's a sender or transmitter, and there's a receiver. And no communication happens unless it's received. And we talk so much in science communication circles about how we can be better transmitters. If only we, get our ways of explaining it more easy or whatever, they will understand. But the question that's always interested me, and I come back to, is who are they? Who are the audience? And I've asked this question in front of many scientific forums and many science communication forums, and nobody knows. And I say, well, I know because I've done the statistics, I've done the research. And basically, as I said, it's well-off white men over 40. How if we don't even know who the audience is, how are we going to do a better job at communicating? So I've devoted my career, for the most part, to trying to communicate with the non-well-off white men over 40. And that's not a value judgment about them. It's just that they're very well, that part of the population is extremely well served. What about the rest of the people? So from the beginning, because I had an intuitive understanding of this because of my own experience being the only girl in the physics department, one of the only girls in the mathematics department, I understood there was a real gap in women's access to science. So one of the things I'm most proud of, when I left university, the first thing that I did was I talked a woman's magazine in Australia. It was a magazine like Vogue. That it was essentially a fashion magazine. It was a brand new magazine and had a wonderful spirit. And it was very beautifully designed, very beautiful photography. It had a very enlightened editor. And I talked her into letting me do a regular column about science and technology. And I did that for 5 years for this magazine. And then later on in Australia, I spent several years writing a regular science column for Vogue and then for Elle Australia. So for 10 years in Australia, I literally wrote regular columns for 3 different women's magazines, including Australian Elle and Vogue, about science and technology. I've never heard of any other science journalist doing anything remotely similar. When I moved to America, I talked to all the women's magazines here, and I showed them my clips because I had lots and lots of clips. And they said, oh, this is wonderful, Margaret. Will you write an article for us about breast cancer or ovarian cancer? And I said, no, I won't. I'll write about every subject under the sun to do with science, except the ways that women's bodies betray them. But they weren't interested in anything. You know, their conception of what science meant in a woman's context meant basically cancer. And as far as I know, it's still that way today. So, you know, I have always wanted to say, if we're serious about getting science communication out there, it seems to be some fantasy that people have that we'll wake up one day and everybody will be looking at NOVA programs or subscribing to Scientific America. I just think this is nonsense. It's not going to happen. NOVA programs in Scientific America is great, but they're not for everybody. So my proposition is that instead of saying that people have to come to science and STEM subjects have to go to the people, and that means going where the people are. Now here's a really interesting fact. In 2002, when I did all the stats about who read the science magazines, in any given month, the top 8 science magazines had a total circulation of something like 15 million. The single top selling woman's magazine had more than that. They didn't even bother to keep the statistics, they were so high. So getting into one women's magazine would reach far, far more women than if you had women subscribing, reading all the science magazines. So I actually regard having written for Vogue and Elle as actually one of the most wonderful and successful things I've ever done. And as someone who has also written for the New York Times and New Scientist and lots of high-powered magazines, I can tell you it's far, far harder to write an article about cosmology for Vogue than it is to write for the New York Times. Because when you write for someone like the New York Times or for New Scientist or Scientific American, you can assume your audience have a fair familiarity with the concepts. When you write for something like Vogue, you know that on the next page there's an ad about eyeshadow or an article about skirt lengths, and you've got to try to keep the reader interested, not alienating them, make them feel included, and also probably injecting a bit of humour into it. So I actually regard that as a radical political act. I can tell you it gets no credit in the science communication world. You know, the science communication world is like, you know, the academic world. Everybody, prestige is tied up with having a feature, a big feature in the New York Times or in one of the science magazines. There is no kudos in speaking outside the canonical forums of legitimation. And this, I think, is a huge, huge problem for science communication, and it's never talked about. if we're serious about getting science out to the people are not reading science magazines. We need to go to what the people are doing. And I think it's a huge dilemma in science communication, because we're just going around, what I see is people going around in the same circles, and people like me who've got degrees in science are very well served. There's lots of stuff out there that's fabulous for somebody like me. There's very little, almost nothing out there that's available to 90% of the population. And if we really want to do STEM outreach and really change, that's the question we need to have to think about. One thing I did in Australia just before I moved here to the US, and I did this in 1989, 1990, was I made a 6-part television science series called Catalyst, aimed at teenage girls. This was made now almost 30 years ago, and it was a 6-part TV series that was aired on ABC Australia about STEM subjects aimed at teenage girls, because at that time there was a huge amount of talk about girls not going into science and how scandalous this was and how we had to do something about it. And I'd had this idea for a while to do this TV series, and finally this big government report came out saying girls are not going to science, what a scandal this is, and finally funding came through from various government bodies and the ABC. I went back to Australia a few months ago, big government report had come out, girls aren't going to science, what can we do about it? And all the issues that were discussed 30 years ago that finally got my TV science series off the ground, every single one of them was back on the table, exactly the same. And I thought, okay, we need to talk about why we're going around the same block, exactly the same block, with no, as far as I can see, no advances had been made in the arguments. The same research had been done to uncover exactly the same things that had been covered 30 years ago by exactly the same process. And I thought, wow, this is the problem. We have to stop thinking that every group of people who comes along is seeing these things for the first time. You know, I've been in science communication for 30 years, and particularly as far as girls go, I see the block that the same things kept being said, and we're not talking about the structural issues about why we keep doing it. So I just want to spend a few minutes finally just telling you about a project that I've been doing for the last 12 years, which is a radical science communication project. This is a project that I do with my twin sister Christine, and what it is that we are crocheting a coral reef. And it's now the biggest art and science project in the world, and I'll be talking about it more in the talk tomorrow that I'm giving. So I don't want to repeat too much of what I'm doing there, but just briefly, when you see corals and they have all these frilly curly forms, they are actually biological manifestations of a kind of geometry called hyperbolic geometry, which is an alternative to the Euclidean geometry we learned about at school. And it turns out that these hyperbolic structures, mathematicians spend, although natural corals and other sea organisms have been making these structures for hundreds of millions of years, human mathematicians spent hundreds of years trying to prove that they were mathematically impossible. And in the 19th century, they finally discovered that not only were they mathematically possible, they were mathematically necessary. But they didn't have a way to make models of these structures. They could write down the equations and you could study them formally like I did at university. But in the 1990s, a Cornell University mathematician, a woman, Dr. STEMinar, discovered that you could make models of hyperbolic structures with crochet. So I'm just going to show you some. So here you see one that's like one of our models of a hyperbolic kelp. And here's a mathematically pure model of a hyperbolic structure. So it kind of looks like a mathematical model, doesn't it? It's rather clear and crisp. And so Dr. STEMinar discovered that you could make these models of this hyperbolic structure. And so for the first time, mathematicians had a way of actually visualizing the structure and playing with it. And you could actually stitch stitch mathematical theorems onto the surface of these structures and prove that certain bizarre mathematical propositions are true by literally stitching them onto the surfaces. Now, my sister and I started doing these mathematical crochets because we love the fusion of mathematics, which we both loved, and handicraft, which we'd grown up doing, learning from our mum. But what we started to realise is that if we made them a bit more loose and didn't stick perfectly to the mathematical form, that instead of taking the mathematically pure ones that Dr. Kamina had done, and we started making, as it were, little variations on it, that the structures began to look more natural, because that's what natural things do. They never have mathematically pure. Like there's nothing in nature that's a perfect sphere, but there are lots of things that are sphere-like. And the same is true with hyperbolic geometry. There's no pure hyperbolic geometry surfaces in nature, but there are lots of things that are variation. So nature is aberrant, nature is deviant. And once you start deviating from the pure formula of Dr. Kamina, you get this whole taxonomy of hyperbolic structures. And we started to realise that if we put them together, they would look like coral reefs, because these are what coral structures are doing. And we come from Queensland, the state in Australia where the Great Barrier Reef is. And at the time we started the project in 2005, that was when scientists were first publicly saying the fact that coral reefs are being bleached in these huge amounts and that they're disappearing is because of global warming. That was around the time when scientists first really were beginning to be clear about that. And so we thought, well, we could crochet a coral reef and we could get a few other people involved and we could use it as a way to introduce them to mathematics and non-Euclidean geometry, and we could also introduce them to climate change. And so we thought this is a fantastic science and math outreach program. It's got mathematics, it's got global warming, it's got ecology, it's got marine biology, it's community art, it's craft, it's everything, and it's feminism. And to our astonishment, 12 years later, it has become the biggest art and science project in the world. We've done it in 40 different cities and 12 different countries all over the globe. More than 10,000 women around the world have participated in making local coral reefs of their own. And it's really been just this wildly successful project that I really think is proof that women are hungering for ways to intersect with math and science, if only they were given ways to do it that are appealing to them. I'm going to end this on a note that I hope we can discuss together, which is the fact that despite the fact that this project has been the most successful science and art project in the world, all of the funding we have had to do it has come from the art world, and every single time that I've approached a science foundation for funding, they've basically said, don't even bother to put in a grant because there can't be any science in a bunch of women knitting. That was a direct quote from the person in America who has the most money to give for science communication. So I'd like to end there just because I think that's an important point on which to begin a discussion about science and STEM and what we can do. So thank you very much. Oh, and by the way, I bought some gifts. This is there's a little book that my organisation's published about mathematics of hyperbolic geometry, an introduction to hyperbolic crochet, and we also published this beautiful book about the Crochet Coral Reef Project and all its intersections of math and science and ecology, etc. And so this, unfortunately, is basically out of print, but we have some copies left, which I bought as a gift for the university.
Good for the University Library.
So please, your comments. And
Can I ask a question? The portion that you were talking about publishing in Elle and Vogue in Australia, one of the things that I see as a real threat in the United States is the populace at large has a real problem distinguishing fact from opinion, right? And so, you know, when you read a magazine like that, you were talking about skirt length or eyeshadow. People are saying those are popular, those are trendy this year because it's someone's opinion. And I'm wondering about how you carefully walk that line of being in kind of an opinion-based magazine and presenting scientific facts.
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I sort of think, so, I mean, I think there's a lot of things to unpack there, but here's one thing. So the New York Times has a science section on Tuesdays. A huge amount of the New York Times is devoted also to articles about arts and culture, and they have huge opinion sections. By the way, opinion sections are the most read sections of newspapers. So, you know, if it's okay to say, well, the New York Times can have art and culture and opinion and politics, why can't why can't a women's magazine? Why does science have to be, what reason is there for saying that science should be only in a pure science magazine, which is about supposedly facts only? Because 90% of people are never going to be subscribers to that. So as to the question of how do you separate fact from opinion, I'm a big believer that those two things are not clearly separated. You know, I mean, when you get into mathematically based science, it's much clearer. I mean, the law of gravity is the law of gravity, and things fall at 9.8 meters per second squared. They don't fall at 9.4 meters per second squared, and we can demonstrably prove that. But there's a hell of a lot, even in the most supposedly rigorous sciences, that is still a matter of opinion. Here's a good one: string theory. Is string theory real science? There are lots and lots of physicists who think that it's not. So I don't think there is this hardcore line between fact and fiction. And I think one of the problems that we face, and I have to say I do think this is a much bigger problem in America than it is elsewhere, that there is a sort of false representation here that there is a hard line between fact and opinion, and I just don't think that's true. And I think one of the problems here is that there's a representation by too many people that fact that there is these things called facts that are self-evident, and I just don't think that's true.
Hi, if I can add, there's a big difference between a magazine publication and a journal publication.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, journals have rigorous peer review,
Mm-hmm.
but magazines are interest pieces, and I certainly don't think a lot of the motorist fanatics would be particularly interested. Well, they may not feel that if you called their magazine an opinion piece, that they would be maybe a little offended. So I would like to kind of stand up for women for that and say that there are some very distinguished articles in some women's magazines.
Yes, definitely. And of course, you know, the point that you make that, you know, pop magazines and popular culture are an entirely different kettle of fish than academic articles. I mean, peer-reviewed journal and, you know, even the New York Times have nothing in common with each other at all, really. Peer writing for academic magazines, journals, is a completely different thing than writing for the public.
You said initially when you were doing your research, I believe you said in 2002, that you contacted like the 15 different science journals and asked for their demographics of their readership. Do you know how they collected their data? Was it through a survey to their readers to see who's authors? And have you looked into it now? Are the demographics the same as they were now?
No, I haven't looked into it now, but yes, I rang up the marketing departments and said, could you give me your demographics? And they have, the reason that they do surveys is because they have to present them to their advertisers. That's the reason that they do it. But no, I'd love to do it again, but you know, I'm a freelance writer and I make my living by the word, and unfortunately these things are very time consuming. I wish I could do the research now, but it's not what I get paid for.
But now you're a science communicator, which is more important actually.
Well, I mean, I think it's all important.
This is beautiful work.
Thank you.
My question is, when I read your abstracts or invitation to come here, I was fascinated, and I'm still am. But my question is, as an educator, where, other than the ed products, where is the science interjecting with the art, other than the ed product? So, in other words, what I'm asking, for example, if I had, for my science class, decide they'll do this project, would they understand math better?
Yes.
Or that type of math? I think that's the piece that is also interesting. I mean, this is interesting by itself for the world of the art, but the junction is, that is where I was missing. Can you talk about that?
Yes. I mean, I'll be talking more, if you come to the talk tomorrow, you'll learn more, or you can come to the workshop this afternoon, and we'll do it. So all the workshops begin with a half-hour discussion on the mathematics underlying it. So the workshop that we have with Andy Wilkinson's class this afternoon, we're not actually going to be crocheting them, we're going to make these models with paper. It's a different way of doing it. But like all of the workshops, when we do the crochet coral reef workshops, they begin with me giving a half-hour presentation about the mathematics, and we learn what non-Euclidean geometry is, and then while people are making the forms, we discuss the implications of hyperbolic geometry, hyperbolic and non-Euclidean geometry. And in fact, the introduction of hyperbolic geometry revolutionized the study of geometry and ultimately led to a generalization of geometry, which led to the mathematics that underlies general relativity, which describes the structure of the universe. So during the workshop, while we're having learnt the basics and then people start making the forms, we then talk about the realization of this non-Euclidean geometry in nature, and particularly the structure of space-time, and we talk about, all sorts of interesting things, like how would you know if you lived in a curved universe, and what are the ways that this geometry helps you to understand that. So basically, in the workshop you learn about the foundations of non-Euclidean geometry, you learn about basically what general relativity is, you learn about how to tell if you lived in a curved universe. And within the course of doing the reef project itself, all of the exhibitions have information not only about the mathematics but also global warming and the devastation of reefs due to climate change. Now, everybody knows about that now in 2017. When we started this project in 2005, when I went around the country and lectured about it, most people in America had never heard that coral reefs were dying out. They certainly didn't know what coral bleaching is. I think everybody on the planet knows what coral bleaching is now. So the project has become a beautiful artistic thing, but it was originally conceived of to communicate about science. And there's a huge amount of science that is conveyed in the course of doing it, and that's why museums and galleries want it, because it is addressing the most important environmental issue of our time. Let's go to who and then.
So just a couple of quick comments. One, I often hear a lot of university women, when you talk about math, oftentimes the first thing that comes out of their mouth is, oh, I can't do math, or I hate math. And often I interpret that to mean I can't do math in the way that it's being presented, or it's presented in a way that I don't like. And the other thing is, you said something which is absolutely true, and in 1926, for example, in my field, I'm a chemist, I know it's something that would have been outre perhaps in Australia, but...
no, it's just we weren't supposed to, because we were supposed to be doing physics and math.
But we were, in 1926 there was an article that was written that said we need to do chemical education better.
Yeah.
In in 2016, there are articles being written saying we need to do chemical education better. So it's almost as though we're not really, and you said it yourself, I mean, 30 years ago, many of the things that were talked about are still being talked about. Why is it that we're so slow to figure this out?
Yes, well, I mean, that's the question I keep coming back to now is, you know, I've been in a number of women in science meetings recently, and people get up and they say this, that, and the other thing. And I'm just amazed that they have no understanding that these discussions took place in the 1990s. And in the 1990s, there was also a movement of feminist philosophers of science who wrote really great books about some of the systemic underpinnings of this. These people don't even seem to know their names. And it's like a whole generation of knowledge has been lost about this. Now, I think that's fairly common vis-a-vis women's stuff. So it's interesting to hear what you're saying about it being lost in terms of chemistry. But, you know, one of the things that I think is going on today, and it is that one of the things that I hear, and I don't know how important it is, but I do keep hearing it, is, oh, we've got all these new technologies. You know, we've got the internet, we've got computer programs. It's all going to be different this time. It's all going to change because we've got this technology. And I just roll my eyes and think, oh yeah. You know, we had this new technology once upon a time. It was called television. And I don't know if you know, but television, when it was first introduced, the same things were said. Television was going to revolutionise education. It was going to be this wonderful medium for getting the public informed about all sorts of things. And now it's, well, I don't think I need to tell anyone what television is, but it's not exactly a locus of much intellectual enrichment, wonderful though it may be. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to piggyback on her question in regards to how we get these two girls when they're younger, because we lose them in elementary school in terms of doing math.
Yeah.
But certainly they will not be crocheting.
Mm-hmm.
So
Sorry,
they will not be crocheting. They
No.
will not be, yeah. So what other methods have you taught? Have you been doing workshops with elementary school teachers or high school teachers so that they know how to interest the girls? Because by the time you're talking to us at university, you lost us a long time ago.
Yes, yes.
So we probably need to be talking to them when they're in very early, in the early grades, if you're going to hang on to them until they come into these complex math you're talking about.
Yes. So let me say two things in response to this. So the first thing is, we didn't conceive of this project as a project to be done by children. We conceived it as a project to be done by adult women, because they're the ones who generally got the crochet skills, or can learn it and probably likely to, really get into it. So we did it we did it as a project for adult people. We always thought there would be more women than men. But my expectation would have been that it would have been, say, 2/3 women and 1/3 men. Actually, it's been 99.99% women. And that actually interests me. That's surprised us. And, it's interesting to reflect on why that might be. But we did not design the project to be for school kids. We designed it as an outreach program for women for women. And almost nobody is targeting, not anybody, not NASA, not the National Science Foundation, not anybody that I know of is targeting science projects to adult women. It's as if adult women are absent from thinking of anybody in society. That said, the question that you're asking comes up every single time I do a talk. What about school kids? We have a whole program where communities or institutions can take up the project, and most of those institutions have been universities, museums, galleries. But there have been half a dozen schools who have decided they wanted to do a coral reef, mostly. There have been a couple of mostly there have been high schools, but there have been a couple of elementary schools who've done it, and so it is possible. And I think I've come to the conclusion now it would make a fabulous educational program. That said, I work from home, the project's been run from my bedroom. I have no funding. We no longer have any funding to do this project. It's the most successful science and art project in the world. It's reached, we've had 2 million visitors to the exhibitions. We've had 10,000 women all over the world participate in it. I still can't get money from the science world. I've given up. I'm moving on. So if you guys have ideas about, but I think it would make a wonderful education program. It takes resources to do that. And it comes back to the question of who's going to fund it. So you and then.
So I was just going to ask, in all these countries that this project has taken off,
Yeah.
over the last decade or two, are you seeing any progress being made as far as more women getting into the sciences? Because my home college is the College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources, and I can tell you just in the last 2 decades, we've seen a dramatic shift in the number of women that we've had as graduate students coming through our programs. It used to be 80 or 90% men, and now it's very close to half and half. But I wonder if you're seeing that in some of the other countries that this project has taken off on.
Well, I don't have the resources to do any of that kind of follow-up, so I mean, I can't really comment on that. What I can tell you is that every institution that does this project has been overwhelmed by the number of women who've wanted to participate. So much so that, they are overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I simply don't have any resources to do any follow-up. We've never done follow-ups of anything. When we did it at the Smithsonian a few years ago, they did a follow-up, and their own internal report said it was the most successful public outreach project that the Smithsonian had ever done. And not only that working with my sister and I changed their own internal views about how they should do public outreach. So that's all I can tell you. I don't have any money or funding to do any form of that kind of research.
I had a question about the coral reef. Are they, the colors that you use in the choices, do they accurately represent a specific reef or anything like that? And if so, would you be able to show the effects of climate change and coral bleaching, like side by side, to show the differences?
Yes, indeed, we do that. So this one, this is all made out of plastic. So we have a whole part of the project that's made out of plastic, because that's also a comment on the tsunami of plastic that's going into the ocean with the Great Pacific Gyres. No coral reef in the world looks like that. It's A, the colours, and B, the fact that it's plastic. But most of I'm going to show you some specific pictures. So most of what we do is art, so it's a fantasy. Most of what our stuff, like that, I mean, no real, that one's also made out of plastic, no real coral looks like that. This that's all made out of videotape, and the white one's all made out of plastic bags. No real corals look like that either. But we have done ones. This is all the plastic section. Okay, so this is good. So this is our invocation of a bleached coral reef. We have 2 of these. They're bleached corals. Now, and so that was exactly trying to do what you were just saying. Can you show the difference between what happens with climate change and not? Well, that coral bleaching is. These bleached reefs are actually extremely beautiful. They're audience favourites. So, they're meant to be, elegies to the fact that real reefs are being absolutely decimated. But, they stand in contrast, because they're white to the, vibrancy of the other ones. Sorry, I'll show you. So this is an installation, we call this our giant coral forest, and obviously no real corals look like that. So it is an artwork, and we've got more and more fantastical over the years. We did start off, and I think I showed you some of the early ones, like that is an attempt to sort of emulate something that really looks like coral, or kelp, sorry. And some of these early ones were inspired by looking at pictures of real corals, but as we moved on, we got, like most artists, we got more and more fantastical.
So, going back, a couple of comments. First of all, going back to a funding perspective, I mean,
Mhm.
you know, STEAM is all the rage now, right?
Yes, it is.
So, it seems to me that there should be some way to incorporate science and art together in a way that would be like NSF and some other agencies would be
Mhm.
responsive to. And the other question is, as I'm looking at this, it's not just mathematics that this also speaks to, because I do chemistry and we're interested in catalysis and stuff like that, and the shapes of surfaces matter in terms of how
Mhm.
things can dock. It also has biological consequences as
Mhm.
well. So from sort of a funding perspective as well,
Mhm.
this could be larger than just teaching mathematics. It could
Mhm.
also be a way of teaching field,
Mhm.
you know, concepts in science as well.
Mhm.
So STEAM, I go back to,
Mhm.
might be something to look at from a funding perspective.
Mm. So, good question that you raise about surfaces. So, some of you, well, you're STEM people. So why do you think that there are so many hyperbolic structures in the sea? It's not arbitrary.
My guess would be energy minimization. I don't know.
It'd be what?
Energy minimization, that would be my guess. But,
Not actually.
okay.
Nutrient absorption?
Sorry?
Nutrient absorption?
Yeah, and why, so tell us
Surface
why you
area.
think. Tell us why you think.
Greater surface area to improve nutrient absorption?
That's right, yeah. So if you're a creature in the sea and you are fixed to one place, you can't go chasing after your lunch, and your lunch is coming floating through the water at you. You want to have maximal surface area to absorb the most food as it comes floating past you. And hyperbolic structures are a really good way to maximize surface area in a given volume.
So if you have a fixed amount of energy, then it's also energy minimization.
That's,
because it's
well,
spread
okay,
over
yes,
water. Yeah.
that's true.
We just come at things
Yes.
differently.
Yes, no, I wonder that, yeah. Yeah, so nature has, as it were, nature has invented hyperbolic structures again and again and again. So coral reefs are full of them. They're in, our intestines have hyperbolic flanges in them. Lots of cells have hyperbolic flanges on the outside of them to absorb nutrients. So nature is full of hyperbolic geometries, and cactuses and frilly vegetables, lettuces, kales, those things. It's all to absorb maximum sunlight. So nature loves mathematics and hits upon mathematical solutions just all over the place in all sorts of ways. And what's very, one of the things that's so interesting about this topic is, it raises the question, so nature's been doing this since at least the Silurian age. Why did so many mathematicians, great mathematicians, spend hundreds of years trying to prove this was impossible? Why? Why didn't they? I mean, I once asked some mathematicians this, and they said, oh, well, I guess there wasn't that many mathematicians sitting around looking at sea slugs. But there were plenty of mathematicians having lettuce for lunch. Why didn't they recognize that these structures were there in front of them? But actually, it turns out to be a really deep and profound question. It was to do with what they thought mathematics was. So again, by entering into a simple thing that I can teach you all, in half an hour, it opens up to profoundly deep questions about what do you think mathematics is? What do you think mathematics can do?
Sorry, I keep asking questions, but how much also, when you say words like hyperbolic geometry, I mean, to somebody who isn't trained in math or science, it sounds really complicated, they won't understand. But if you show them coral, they can look at that and say, oh yeah, that's really pretty, I can get a sense of what that is. And so how much of our inability to communicate is tied up with our inability to make things, understandable?
Well, as if you come to the workshop, you will find out that by the end of the workshop, you will know a lot more mathematics. You actually know a lot more mathematics now than you think you do. And B, by the end of the workshop, you know a lot more mathematics, and you realize that in fact, everybody knows a lot more mathematics than they think they do. They're just not taught it that way. But if you want the formalities, it will be in the workshop, but also this little book, which is, I don't know, it's not very long. You can learn the fundamentals of hyperbolic geometry and its implications for general relativity and what we know about the structure of space-time and the growth of critters. And, that's not a 500-page textbook. It's probably an essay of 10,000 words max, probably even less. And I believe that this is one of the things that we as science communities are called upon to do, is how can we really communicate complex ideas in ways that are accessible. That's our job. And I do think that, I can't speak for for STEM education, except my own, which was pretty dismal in school. I got a good university education, but I got a very dismal school education. I think we urgently need ways to help teachers be better teachers, and that, again, it comes back to the money. Who's going to support that? I'm interested, I've been working for the last 15 years on doing things like the Crochet Read project and other projects, which are about engaging people with math and teaching math and science concepts through hands-on material play practices. And I think I'm absolutely adamant that my goal is to get people to understand complex abstract ideas. I mean, it's nice that they build pretty things, and that's lovely, but really my goal is to get them to understand abstract, complicated ideas, the kinds of ideas that I learned at university. Now, they're never going to be able to compete with full-on mathematicians, but so what? We need the full-on expert mathematicians, but we also need a public who have a lot more math and science knowledge than they do. But as I say, I think there's real snobberies in the funding world about what's conceived of as being, I mean, as I said, this guy said to me, there can't be any real science in a bunch of women knitting. He wouldn't even let me put in an application. That says something about what's conceived of as being science, legitimate science outreach. So how do we get over that? And I really don't know what the answers. That's where I was hoping to have that discussion with you guys.